This story begins with the fact that I, Michael, now in my 50s, often recall some moments from my youth. One of those moments, which does not give me peace, was the story with Svetlana, my ex-fiancée, with whom I was together during my student years. It was not just a love story, but something much more complex, full of intrigue and a bitter truth that I learned later. Svetlana, or, as I will now call her, Alice, was a girl I met in the first years of university. She was self-confident, strong, ambitious. She was one of those people who always knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to take it. I was young and head over heels in love with her. I remember how, after 2 years of relationship, it was she who proposed to me, which was quite unusual at the time. We decided to get married and even submitted an application to the local RAC. But something began to change. And what seemed perfect began to fall apart. One day, after we decided to get married, I told my best friend, George. He was a person I could discuss everything with, but the reaction to my happy news was unexpected. He just laughed. I didn't think much of it at first, but his laugh left an unpleasant residue on me. "What's funny?" I asked, hoping for some humorous response. But he just waved it off. "It's okay, kill it." After that conversation with George, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Alice started leaving classes early, saying she had some business, and sometimes just going to another building of the university under the pretext of preparing for seminars. It worried me, but I tried to push those thoughts away, convincing myself that they were just my doubts. But one evening, when I called her, she said she was sitting in the library preparing for a seminar. I could clearly hear the music in the background and it was amazing. Library? I thought. Instead of the sounds of quiet reading rooms, I heard some rhythms, as if she was not where she said she was. Something started spinning in my head and I decided to wait. Wait and check. That was my first inkling that something strange might be going on. My young mind refused to accept the worst, but suspicions grew every day. I decided not to talk about it with her anymore and not to show that I noticed anything. And then I began to carefully follow her behavior. At first it was just minor details, the phone she suddenly started carrying with her all the time, even though we used to always leave it on the table during dinner. Then a closed look when I asked about her day. But the most difficult thing was not this, but my own mind, which created new scenarios. One evening, when she again said that she would be back late due to studies, I decided to go to the place where she should have been, the library. I sat in the corner and watched whoever came in and out, but she was not there. Neither at school nor in the library. After that evening, I realized that I had to act more decisively. But how to find out the truth? I found myself thinking more and more about what was happening and what I would learn if I just let go of control. And then one day, when I decided to check her phone, hoping to find something to reassure me, I discovered that it now had a password on it. That was the moment when everything changed for me. Alice and I were always open with each other and there were never any secrets. So this password wasn't just a signal to me, it was a big red flag. I didn't ask her for the password right away because I knew it would raise suspicions. But the secret began to eat away at me from the inside. And then I decided to do my own investigation. Without the help of detectives or outsiders, I knew I had to find out the truth myself. After I saw the password on Alice's phone, everything started to change. I couldn't stop the flow of thoughts clouding my mind. I knew I had to learn more. Now, in my 50s, I can say that it was like a game of chess, where every move has a meaning and one wrong move can ruin everything. I wasn't ready to destroy our relationship then, but I couldn't look at her the way I used to. It became difficult to trust. A few days after that password incident, I noticed another thing that bothered me. Alice became withdrawn, especially when I tried to talk to her about our upcoming wedding. She used to be so excited about it, making the guest list, picking out the dress, but now it's like her interest is gone. I couldn't understand what had happened, but I knew I had to act. One evening, when she said she was going to meet her university friends, I decided to seize the moment. I stayed home, but not to rest. My goal was simple, to look through her phone. I knew it sounded mean, but at the time it seemed like the only way to know the truth. As soon as she left, I went over to her desk, where the phone was always lying. Password stopped me. For several minutes I just sat and stared at him, trying to come up with a reasonable solution. But nothing came to mind, except for the only option, to observe. The next day, I happened to notice Alice leaving her laptop on the kitchen table after taking a shower. This was my opportunity. I opened it and there, in the browser, was an open email. Apparently she forgot to close the tab. This was the first indication that something was wrong. The letter was addressed to someone named Mark, and its content was far from ordinary. He began with the words, "I miss you so much, I can't wait for our next meeting." My heart beat faster. I reread it several times, trying to make sense of what I read. Who is Mark? Why does she write such things to him? I decided not to panic and proceed with caution. I took a screenshot of the letter and emailed it to myself to gather evidence later. At that time, I was not ready for the confrontation. After that evening, Alice acted as if nothing had happened. She was as smiling and sweet as I knew her. But I could no longer look at her with the same eyes. Every time she talked about work or studying, I remembered that letter, thinking that every word she said was a lie. The next few days were the hardest for me. I ran through different scenarios in my head, maybe it was just a friend, or something innocent. But my heart was restless, and I knew I had to learn more. My curiosity and suspicions grew, and then I decided to act more radically. One evening, when Alice said she was going to stay late studying, I decided to go to where she was supposed to be, the building where she usually spent her time. I got into the car and drove there, stopping near the building. I sat and watched the students come and go, but she was nowhere to be seen. My patience was running out when I suddenly noticed her coming out of the door of another building. But she was not alone. A man was with her. And it was none other than George, my best friend, the same George who laughed at my decision to marry her. My heart sank. They walked side by side, and I saw her leaning her head on his shoulder. They looked as if there was no secret between them. They were together. I sat in the car, not believing my eyes. What is it? I tried to find an explanation, but I had none. They just left, got into a taxi and drove away. I could feel the ground slipping away from under my feet and I couldn't believe it was true. What now? What should I do with this information? After that evening, when I saw Alice and George together, everything began to fall apart. It felt like someone knocked the ground out from under my feet. I sat in the car, almost paralyzed, not knowing what to do next. What was it? Just friendship or something more? But those hugs and the way she confided in him as if they were more than just friends. I didn't have enough words to describe how much it all hurt. The next few days passed in a blur. I kept scrolling through the scenes I saw in my head. I thought about George, my friend, and how he could do this to me. We were inseparable from the first days of school, and I always trusted him. I couldn't believe he was the one Alice was spending time with behind my back. I decided not to jump to conclusions, but the question of betrayal did not leave me. I began to carefully monitor their behavior without showing that I suspected anything. Their every move seemed suspicious to me, and the more I watched, the more little things I found that indicated that there was something more than friendship between them. For example, before George rarely mentioned Alice in our conversations, now, every time we saw each other, I could feel him trying to avoid talking about her. There was nothing left but to move on. I decided to test a few of my guesses, although part of me was afraid of what I might find. I started by going through our old photos and messages with George. A few months ago, when our relationship with Alice was at its peak, he began to invite me to our usual meetings less often, citing a lack of time. I did not pay attention to it, but now everything began to form a single picture. One evening, when Alice said again that she was going to be late for school, I decided to check where she really was. I knew it was bordering on paranoid, but I couldn't help myself. For the first time in a long time, I followed her. I felt like the hero of a bad spy movie, but otherwise I couldn't find the answer. I didn't want to go into a confrontation without concrete evidence. At first everything went as she said. She did come to the university, but instead of going to class, she headed in the other direction, to the cafe next to the building. I stood far away and watched as she went inside. A few minutes later, George approached her. They sat down together at the table and started chatting as if they were on a romantic date. This again confirmed my worst suspicions. I sat in my car watching them talk and laugh. It was unbearable. Every moment of their interaction felt like a knife in the back. I decided not to follow anymore because I knew that was enough. I drove home, but instead of being relieved by the information I received, I felt even worse. That was not all. I decided to go ahead and look at her laptop again like last time. I was hoping to find more evidence to make sure there really was something more between them. And I found it. There were photos in her personal folder. Photos of their secret meetings. Some of the pictures were of them in the park, others of the same cafe where I saw them recently. But what was a real hit was the photo where they were holding hands. It could no longer be ignored. Now I had all the evidence. I saved these files for myself, but what do I do next? I sat in the kitchen in silence, trying to collect my thoughts. How did it happen? How could I be so blind? I could see Alice and George building a relationship behind my back, but I had no idea how to act. The worst part was that I loved her. Despite all the evidence, despite everything I learned, I didn't want to end our relationship. She was everything to me, and even now, when I saw her with someone else, a part of me refused to accept what was happening. I decided not to take hasty steps. My pride was wounded, but I decided to act with a cool head. I knew a confrontation was only a matter of time, but first I wanted to try to collect all the evidence. I felt that this was only the beginning and that there were more surprises ahead of me. The days passed slowly, as if each moment was weighed down by the weight of what I knew but hadn't yet said. I couldn't decide how to approach the confrontation. That evening, when I saw Alice and George together, my confidence in my own actions was shaken. I never imagined myself in the role of someone who would face betrayal, especially such a vile betrayal by my best friend. I decided to proceed gradually, starting with George. If I had any chance of learning more of the truth, it had to start with him. He was someone I had known for many years, so I hoped that he would say something frankly, although I wasn't sure of it anymore. One evening I invited him over to my house for a beer, just as we had done many times before. The meeting looked completely normal. We talked about football, work, everything that friends usually discuss. But I could sense that George was tense, though he tried to hide it. There was an invisible tension between us that only becomes apparent when you know about the betrayal. I decided to start with something easy to gather more information. After a few beers I pretended to be wondering how he was spending his time lately. I asked if he was seeing anyone, hinting at a relationship. He blushed a little, but quickly composed himself. "No, not that much, work is busy," he replied, avoiding a direct answer. But it was enough for me to notice his nervousness. I took another gulp of beer and decided to drop him a direct tip. "You know, I noticed you recently with Alice. You looked like you had some secrets. Is there something you want to tell me?" My words sounded so familiar that it was more like a friendly request than an accusation. George laughed at first as if it were a joke, but I saw his hands tense up for a moment. "Alice? But nothing like that, we talk sometimes. You know, we're all at the university together, so we cross paths by chance," he answered. I waited for him to pause and then I decided to act. "Accidentally?" George, I saw you together in a cafe and it didn't look like you just met by chance. Of course you can try to explain it away, but I'm not stupid, I said calmly looking into his eyes. His face paled for a moment. He pushed the beer away and nervously looked away. Look, Michael, it's not what you think, he began, but I could already see something inside him snapping. He began to pick out words, but it didn't matter anymore. He knew what I suspected and that I had collected enough evidence. You think I don't know? Why don't I see you and her spending time together? I know there is something between you two. Can you explain to me what it really is? My voice remained even, but a storm was boiling inside me. George was silent for a few seconds, as if considering what to say. He took a deep breath and, as if giving up, replied, "Okay, Michael, I'll tell you the truth. We've had a few meetings, but that doesn't mean anything. We just sometimes walked together, talked. She was complaining about you, saying that you had become withdrawn. Sometimes it all came to something bigger, but it was never serious." His words rang out like a blow to the chest. It was just as I suspected, but hearing it from him was completely different. They were dating, spending time together, and worst of all, it was more than just friendship. George tried to convince me it wasn't serious, but in my head the fact was serious enough to end it all. Do you understand that this is treason? And even if you try to cover it up, I can't forgive it. I trusted you, George, and you didn't just take my trust away, you destroyed it, I said, feeling like an unbridgeable rift had formed between us. He looked devastated and I could tell he didn't know what to say. He mumbled a few apologies, but I didn't want to hear any more. After a few minutes of silence, he got up and left, leaving me alone in the apartment. When the door closed behind him, I felt powerless. I didn't know what to do anymore. A confrontation with Alice was now inevitable, but I wasn't ready for it. What should I say? Will I be able to keep calm when I talk to her? After George left, I was left alone with my thoughts. The walls of the apartment pressed on me like never before. It was quiet, and the silence seemed deafening. All evening I was in a state of deaf numbness. The same questions were running through my head: how long did it last? Why did she choose him? Is it all over or are they still dating? I didn't know how to approach Alice. What was I supposed to say? I saw her with another man. I knew they were dating, and even George admitted it, but I still wasn't ready to just come up and say, "I know you cheated on me." Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation, hoping it would somehow dry itself out, but my mind told me it couldn't. I couldn't live a lie. I woke up the next morning with the clear intention of talking to her. Today will be the day I learn the whole truth. I watched Alice get ready for work as if nothing had happened. She looked calm, smiling at me as usual, but I knew something dark was hiding behind that mask. I looked at her with different eyes, and her every movement seemed fake. When she got home from work that evening, I gathered my strength. I was sitting on the couch in the living room waiting for her to come in. As soon as she crossed the threshold, I could feel the tension in the room begin to build. She immediately noticed that something was wrong. Her smile gradually faded and she stopped looking at me. "Michael, what happened?" she asked, trying to keep her tone calm, but I could tell she was nervous. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "We need to talk," I said, gesturing for her to sit next to me. She sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap. The tension was in the air and I could feel every word falling hard between us. "Can you explain what's going on between you and George?" I asked simply, not wanting to play games. Her face froze for a moment, but she quickly gathered herself and began to defend herself. "George. There is nothing between us. We're just friends, Michael." "You know that," she replied, but I could hear the lie in her voice. That was what I was afraid of, she wasn't going to tell the truth. "Don't lie to me, Alice," I said, not raising my voice, but firmly. "I know about you. I saw you together. And George has already confessed everything. She turned pale. A look of panic appeared on her face, and I could see her trying to find words, but she couldn't say anything. The moment of silence seemed like an eternity, and finally she lowered her head as if giving up. I didn't mean to. She began in a whisper, barely able to get the words out. It all happened by chance. We just started hanging out more. It was innocent at first and then it got out of hand. Her confession sounded like a sentence. This was the moment when all my fears were confirmed. I looked at her and felt the walls of our world crumble into dust. She kept talking but I could barely listen to her. It meant nothing, Michael. George, he was there when you were busy. I don't know how it happened. I cut her off. How long has it been going on? She sighed, as if weighing whether to tell the truth at all. Several months. We sometimes met, but I swear it wasn't serious. A few months. She cheated on me with my best friend for months and I didn't notice. I felt everything inside me clench in pain. It was too much. I got up from the couch, feeling like I couldn't sit next to her anymore. Why? I asked, standing with my back to her. Why did you do that? What did I do wrong? She fell silent. I could hear her breathing heavily as she tried to find answers to these questions. I don't know, Michael, she replied. It's not you. It's just. I didn't know what I wanted. You were there, but you became different. We have become different. Her words cut through me like a blade. It wasn't just George. It was us. Our relationship, which I thought was perfect, fell apart a long time ago and I didn't notice it. But this did not remove her guilt, and did not reduce the pain of the fact that she betrayed me. I stood still, not knowing what to do next. We were both silent. Time seems to have stopped. I think we need to take a break, I finally said. Those were hard words, but I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't continue this relationship when the trust was broken. She didn't answer anything. I knew it was over for us, even if the words hadn't been spoken yet. Many years have passed since my life was turned upside down by the betrayal of Alice and George. Now that I am 50 years old, I can tell this story without bitterness or pain, but then, in those days, it seemed like the end of the world. I was young, naive, I thought I had found my true love. It turned out that life has its own unpredictable scenarios, and each of them carries a lesson. After our conversation with Alice, things quickly fell apart. We broke up almost immediately and I left the relationship feeling like everything I believed was a lie. At first, I didn't know how to live on. Everything seemed empty and meaningless. However, there was one thing I held on to, and that was studying. I decided that I would not allow this destruction to drag me into the darkness. I threw all my energy into my studies. Instead of letting the pain destroy me, I used it as an engine, as an inspiration. I spent every day in the library, over books, immersing myself in the educational process. I couldn't control what happened to Alice, but I could control what happened to me next. And it worked. The more I studied, the more I realized that this event, painful as it was a turning point in my life. I began to see the future and the possibilities that opened before me. I graduated with honors, found the job of my dreams, and gradually my life began to recover. Time heals wounds. After breaking up with Alice, I thought I would never be able to trust anyone again, but life has shown me otherwise. A few years after graduating from university, I met my future wife, Julia. She was completely different. She didn't try to change me or influence my life. She supported me, was honest and open from the beginning. We got married a year after we started dating. Julia gave me what I always wanted, peace and confidence in a relationship. We built our life together, with love and trust, and now we have 2 wonderful children of whom we are very proud. Now, looking back on those distant days, I understand that without all those events, I would not have become who I am. Alice and George were part of my youth, and while they shattered my confidence, they also gave me the drive to be better, forced me to re-evaluate my priorities, and open myself up to new possibilities. My career is at its peak now. I have a stable job that brings me not only profit, but also satisfaction. My family is what I am most grateful to fate for. Every day I come home with a sense of peace and joy, knowing that there are people waiting for me who love me as I am, without secrets or lies. And although sometimes I remember the times when things were different, I understand that this history has remained in the past. I am no longer the young man who let betrayal define my life. I have come a long way, and now I have everything I could have ever dreamed of. It's a lesson I'll never forget, but also a reminder that with every pain comes a new beginning.